Well, I'm pleased and honored to be with you tonight. It's actually my first time visiting this church. I was told to speak into the mic, so if you can't hear me, just raise a hand, and unless you're praising Jesus, I will take that as a sign I need to speak into the mic. Yeah, my name is Blake Quackenbush, and I am an attorney, and I have worked with hundreds of cases and also thousands of consultations in which in just about every one there is some aspect of domestic violence. So I use the word domestic violence because under Alaska law it is actually referred to as domestic violence, but interpersonal violence is probably more accurate and to the point if we think about what it is we're actually talking about. And so I wanted to start off first of all by just going over some statistics that I think you might find interesting. So first, nearly 20 people per minute are physically assaulted by a household member in the United States. And during 1 year, this equates to more than 10 million people experiencing violence. And that's both men and women. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by a household member. And between 21 and 60% of victims of domestic violence or interpersonal violence lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from that violence. Most people don't want to go to work with a black eye. 1 in 15 children are exposed to violence by a household member each year, and 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to the actual violence. And just imagine what witnessing that does to a young child who doesn't know better, what lessons are taught by viewing that. Now, I got to admit, I have a humongous pet peeve when it comes to talking about domestic violence. And my pet peeve is this: people don't take it seriously enough. And what I mean by that is they call things abuse when we are talking about violence. They will refute, and we'll get into this a little bit later on when I get into this. But my goal tonight is to help you identify what is domestic violence, know how to fix domestic violence, it is fixable, and know how to prevent domestic violence from ever happening in the first place. So I want to start off with a couple of examples. And these examples, I'm going to basically give you a statement, and in your head you're going to say, is this or is this domestic violence? You don't have to say it out loud. But you're more than welcome to if you want to. But if I were to say to you that a husband came home from work and took a loaf of white soft bread and struck his wife with a loaf of white bread over the head, is that domestic violence? It's domestic violence. Is it domestic violence if the husband, being 6'8", 300 pounds, is repeatedly hit by his wife, who is 5'3", with a loaf of bread? Is that domestic violence? Even if it's the woman hitting the man? Yes, it is domestic violence. What about spanking children? No, that is not domestic violence. It's not domestic violence because it's a constitutionally protected right. We have the right to raise our children however we like, within certain parameters. Right. You can spank a child, but you can't slap a child in the face. You can't punch a child. You're not supposed to kick a child. You can get into trouble for that under Alaska law. Now, what about, you see it on television shows and things, people get mad and then they break something. They break a dish in the sink if they're mad, or they punch a hole in the wall, or they slam a door so hard that it breaks the hinges. That is domestic violence. Yeah. What about just arguing with somebody? That's not domestic violence. And actually, you're right. It does depend. Because in an argument, if you were to say, I'm going to kill you, that is domestic violence. If you say, I'm going to cut you or whatever, that's domestic violence. But just arguing with somebody is not domestic violence. People have arguments. People have robust conversations. Doesn't mean that they're engaging in domestic violence. So that's kind of a precursor to what the statutes are in Alaska, the Alaska laws that we deal with on a daily basis. And so I wanted to go through and just highlight some of the main things that people need to look for when they're trying to identify domestic violence. The first thing is domestic violence is only domestic violence if it is between a household member and another household member. So if you go to a bar and you get in a fight at a bar, that is not domestic violence, right? If it's between a household member and a household member under Alaska law, then that's domestic violence. That doesn't mean it's not wrong. You know, you shouldn't be fighting anybody. We should be loving our neighbors. Well, right. So if you were at a bar and it's your brother who lives in the same house with you, then that would be that. But what is household member? Household member includes current or former spouses, anyone who lives together or who has ever lived together. So, for example, we may have lived together as children. We then grew up. We then lived in separate households. If something happened to us, that would be domestic violence, assuming that was domestic violence. Anyone who's ever engaged in a sexual relationship, anyone who is related to another person. They call it up to the 4th degree of sanguinity, but in any event, it just means closely related individuals, first cousins. Anyone related to another person, including through adoption or related, or if they were previously related. So if you got divorced, you would still technically be a household member. Okay, that's the boring stuff. Think to yourself why domestic violence is so harmful. It's harmful because it destroys families. That's why there's such a heavy emphasis on the household member nature of domestic violence. The government, and frankly, we don't always trust the government, but the government likes families. We know this because of taxes. They give you credits for children. Have as many kids as you want. We're going to give you a tax credit. Okay. Also dependents who are not children. If you're caring for somebody else, you know, an elderly person who can't work, then, you know, you're going to get a benefit. So the government does like families. Families produce children, children produce, you know, producers and shoppers and commerce, and it grows our economy and so on. That's why they're so concerned about domestic violence. But we're concerned about domestic violence because it destroys our household unit. When we don't have a household unit in place, then we go to other sources to replace whatever we should have been getting from our family, right? And that can be drugs, that can be bad influences, that can be all sorts of things. Now, types of domestic violence include violating a protective order, harassment, crimes against the person, like assault, so punching, kicking, hitting somebody, reckless endangerment, like drunk driving with a child in the backseat, that's technically domestic violence. Stalking people, it's just like it sounds, stalking people. But here's a weird one that most people don't think about. Say you get in an argument with your spouse and you take your children and you leave state. You go back to, you know, whatever state you originally came from. And when you get there, you don't tell that other person where you went. That is actually an act of domestic violence. It's actually a crime. It's called custodial interference in the 1st degree. Custodial interference in the 2nd degree is when you don't leave state, but you just go off and hide the children someplace. That can be domestic violence. Now, we're all familiar that sexual assault, that is domestic violence. Sexual assault means when I say no and you keep going, that is assault. That is sexual assault. Children under age of 18 can't consent. So anything involving them is going to be domestic violence. Now, here's some weird ones that I thought were funny, but maybe you, hopefully you found them funny. I think it's funny. Remember, we said that domestic violence is between a household member and another household member. But the statute actually lists indecent exposure as an act of domestic violence. So have you ever had that moment where you get out of the shower and you go looking for a towel and there's no towel and there's about 50 feet between the door of your bathroom and your room and you just make a run for it? If anybody happens to see you in that moment, unfortunately, that is domestic violence, technically under the law. So there are degrees to this. I mean, is anybody going to prosecute anybody for, you know, run into the room after, you know, using the shower? Probably not. But keep it in mind, indecent exposure does qualify. Now, another weird. That is in Alaska, but I'm sure other states have adopted it as well. But there's another one that's another aspect that's kind of interesting. Lawyers are weird, just so you know. I'll admit I'm weird. And the reason why I'll say I'm weird is because we think strange things are interesting. So we'll say this is interesting. And then when I tell you, you're probably like, well, that is not that interesting. So for example, if you commit an act of domestic violence in your house that involves a sexual offense, you can actually forfeit whatever property you own that is involved in the act. So if you commit a sexual offense inside your house, you can actually forfeit your entire house, meaning police can come charge you with the sexual offense and they can take your house away from you. So it is that serious. And one of the reasons why that's so serious is because we do want to protect children. We do want to protect spouses. We don't want sexual offenses to ever occur. Other strange acts. Oh, go ahead. So it's against any household member, right? So the question is, if there was a sexual offense perpetrated against any household member, could you forfeit property related to that offense? And the answer is yes, any household member. So that could be a cousin, that could be child, that could be spouse. In addition to this, another strange one is extortion. Most people understand what the word extortion is, but even lawyers have to look it up. Extortion is, for example, when your spouse says to you that if you don't give them the car, the house, the money, then they're going to accuse you of a crime. Or if they say, if your spouse says, if you don't give me the car, the money, etc., then we're going to expose confidential information or a secret that you told me about to other people. That is actually a crime. It's called extortion. You can't extort things out of people. Another one is coercion, and it's a little bit different from extortion. Coercion is basically, it doesn't involve property. So extortion means give me some sort of property or else I'm gonna X. Coercion is not that way. Coercion is just, for example, if your spouse says that if you don't apply for a job, they're going to physically assault you. I'm going to hit you if you don't apply for a job. So I'm not asking for any property, but if you don't do what I'm saying, I'm going to hurt you or hurt somebody. And these may sound strange or silly, but these happen all the time. I hear about extortion or coercion in an extremely large number of cases that come to our office. Do they get prosecuted criminally? Not a lot, but they're so harmful that the legislature saw fit to make them not only illegal, but also acts of domestic violence. And when you have a criminal case, they call it a domestic violence modifier. It means you actually get a harsher sentence if it happens to be domestic violence related. So that's the legislature saying, we like families intact, we like families healthy. And if you go into someone's house and violate the sanctity of the family, then we're going to take, harsh approach to it. How do we fix domestic violence? We've started to identify it, and you're getting an idea or a sense to yourselves that, wow, domestic violence is a lot. But how do we fix it? So we fix domestic violence by getting help. Some of the best sources of help are right where we are right now. When your family is broken, you need to go to the Lord. You need to go to your pastors. You need to go to your leaders. You need to show up. That's one of the first ways, one of the best ways. In addition to that, we have domestic violence hotlines nationwide. I'll tell you a number. You might forget it, but write it down. It's 1-800-799-7233. That's a hotline you can call 24/7. There's always somebody there, and there's always somebody there to help you get to where you need to go. We also, in Anchorage alone, have battered women's shelters. There's a place called Awake, AWAIC. It provides 24/7 support for abused women looking for help. And they provide shelters, rooms, food. There's also Catholic social services. They also provide Clare House for families to stay and 24 access to services that they need. And then one of my personal favorites is my cell phone. So you're more than welcome to call me. I don't charge for consultations, and I'm happy to do that for you. And this is not a pitch for my law firm either. Every person that calls me for a consultation, I'm happy to give them my cell phone number. They can use it for life. And I get calls in the middle of the night all the time. APD's at the house, something's happened. There's a lot of chaos. They can put me on the phone, and I'm happy to help. So my cell phone number is 907-715-4942. 907-715-4942. The reason why I provide that number to you is because I agree. Domestic violence is so harmful. It has to be stopped. It has to be fixed. And these are some of the ways that we can do that. Sure. Yeah, it's 907-715-4942. Another way to fix domestic violence is to go to the state and ask for the state to help. And what I mean by that is go to the court and go get what's called a protective order. There are two types of protective orders. There is what's called a 20-day ex parte domestic violence protective order. That 20-day ex parte order is very easily received. You basically walk in, tell the court that you've experienced the domestic violence we just talked about, and then explain that you want an order that will protect you. And what they'll do is they will serve that order on the person who offended you, the person who did the domestic violence, and that will keep them away from you for 20 days. That's kind of the basic level. If it is so severe that you want this person permanently away from you for at least a year, you can go get what's called a long-term protective order. They generally do it in two stages. You generally request a 20-day ex parte, and then on the 20th day or the 19th day, they will schedule an additional hearing where you can go in and ask for a longer protective order. Now, getting a long-term order is not easy. And if you're in that position, you're more than welcome to call me, and I'm happy to walk through it with you for free. We don't normally represent people in the early stages of a domestic violence case. They generally go down and do that without us. But if you need to know where to go or how to do it, we're more than happy to guide you through that process because it is so important. The long-term order stays in place for 1 year, and then after that, it's dissolved. But it does have lasting consequences. And it brings me to my next point. How do we ever prevent people from getting into a position where our families get broken like that? Okay, first of all, we can fix our families. We can do that if that happens, and we can prevent it from ever happening again. One of the ways that we can prevent it is by getting a protective order. When you get a protective order against somebody, it goes on their court view. And let's just say I enter the dating scene. I'm married, I'm happily married, but say I enter the dating scene and I meet a really nice gal and she seems awesome, but I don't really know anything about her. And nobody else really knows anything about her. Thank goodness for court view, because you can actually Google her and find out if she has a history of domestic violence. And that'll be important because this could be the person you want to raise children with. What kind of example do you want your children seeing and being exposed to? How do we prevent this? We need to prevent domestic violence, and one of the ways we can best do it is, well, by taking our pills. And by that, what I mean is, I'm going to give you a little bit of an analogy. Have you ever noticed that in the modern world, there seems to be a pill for everything? There's a pill to make you sleep. There's a pill to wake you up. There's a pill to chill you out. There's a pill to increase your work performance. There's a pill to put you in the mood. There's a pill to make you focus. There's a pill to not make you depressed. But have you ever wondered, why is there no pill to not just bring you back to normal? Why is there no pill to constantly make you happy, to fix your families, to all that stuff? Well, you're in luck, because as a lawyer, you actually earn a degree called a Juris Doctorate degree. So technically I'm a doctor, and I'm going to give you a prescription right now for a pill that you can take that's going to help you avoid domestic violence. This is the regimen. Number 1, choose your spouse wisely. Maybe some of you have already made that choice, but you can choose your spouse every day, and you should. If you already have a spouse, choose them every day. Continue to choose them. Before you have a spouse, make that the most serious decision of your life. Sometimes people will put their careers first, their job first, anything but that decision first. But that is the most important reason. Why? Because 99.999% of your misery or happiness will be based on that one decision alone. Here's the other thing. Now, I know we're in a church, and I know we believe in the atonement, Christ's sacrifice for us, but statistically, people don't change unless there is some sort of miracle that takes place in their life. But we can't plan on people changing. We got to plan on people being people, and that's how it is. But that's not to say we shouldn't recognize a miracle when we see it. When people do change, that's awesome, and that's what we should encourage. But don't plan on it. If somebody is acting a certain way that before you marry them, they're probably going to continue doing that once you're married to them, or even worse. So know who you're dating. Look them up on CoreView. Meet all their friends. Meet all their family. See who this person interacts with when you're not around. And then also watch for warning signs. Individuals who experienced violence as children have a really high likelihood of perpetrating violence later on. People don't go out and date people who are jealous of your friends or jealous of your time that you spend away from them. Don't date people who discourage you. Don't date people who embarrass you. Don't date people who control you or your finances. Don't date people who make you feel guilty. And don't date people who prevent you from working. Don't date people who intentionally damage your property or threaten violence against you unless you do something that they say they want you to do. Don't date people who intimidate you physically. Now, I keep using the word date because I really wanted to sell the relationship side of domestic violence. But also, don't put people inside your house around your family who have all of the characteristics that I just listed. You know, there's an ancient, excuse me, my next point is communicate, or my next pill to prescribe to you is communicate calmly. It's one of the hardest skills to master. First of all, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen more than we speak. There's an ancient Sufi saint from Eastern religions, but what he said was true. He said that the reason why people shout when they're angry is that because although they are next to each other physically, their hearts are so far apart, and because their hearts are so far apart, they feel the need to shout to make up the difference. But you can close that gap by whispering. Have you ever noticed that when people speak very quietly, everyone tends to lean forward and listen to what they're saying? You probably experienced that just now. That's what you'll see with politicians, or if you've ever seen a TED Talk or a really good speaker on television. They slow things down, they speak quietly and slowly, and they get their point across. Now, communicate effectively. That's another pill I'll give you. Communicating effectively is also very important. Your words have meaning. So swearing at each other, calling each other names, things like that, that is only going to hurt your relationship. And when you do it, they do it. And everyone starts to build on each other until you're in a situation where you could be experiencing domestic violence. Now, if you have trouble communicating, if somebody is just impossible to communicate and there's no getting rid of this person, like an ex-spouse, you're never going to get rid of them. You're always going to have children in common, right? And there's always going to be that ex-spouse. You can have communication through an app called My Family Wizard. And in that app, what it will do is it will monitor your communication with each other and force you to communicate in a healthy way. So for example, if you throw a swear word in there, it won't let you send the message until you change your message. It will also pick up on sarcasm. So it's a lot smarter, than you might think. It can pick up on the sarcasm in your tone, and it'll say you need to change your tone because I won't let you send this message unless you do. So it's really helpful for two people who cannot communicate. Now, another thing that people often forget about is when you're in a heated argument, people generally get upset because they feel like they're not being respected or loved. Everybody wants to be loved. And when they feel like you're not listening to them, they feel like they're not being loved. And so reassuring a person that, look, I know we disagree, but I love you and I'm not going anywhere. Reassuring that person will actually cause them to not want to control the situation, because sometimes when people feel caged, they want to control the situation. And if they can't control it through their words, through shouting at you or through whatever, then they start trying to control you through violence and other things, coercive behavior, things like that. So reassuring the other person that, hey, I love you, speaking calmly to them, that can get them to re-enter and communicate with you in an effective manner. Here's the last thing, and I'm not going to lie, because I don't lie. I know that's awkward for an attorney to say, but it's true. Don't drink alcohol. I know we're allowed to, okay? Christ drank wine, we know this. It was his first miracle, but don't drink alcohol socially. Don't drink alcohol socially. Do you know why I tell you that? Is because the vast majority of the cases that I see that wind up in court with people losing kids and people losing their families and families falling apart are families where they have engaged in a lot of drinking or drugs. It's actually getting to the point where electronic dance festivals don't even want alcohol anywhere on the premises. Imagine going to an outdoor concert and not being able to have a beer. They find it so bad that they don't even want it at these modern dance festivals anymore because it leads to domestic violence. Let me put this more into perspective. How is it that drunk or high people always want to talk about really serious decisions? Have you noticed this? Are they in any sort of state of mind that that is a good idea? No, but they never want to talk about it when they're not drunk or high, right? They never want to talk about these serious things or these loving conversations when they're not drunk or high. Get rid of the alcohol, get rid of the drugs. That, I assure you, will solve the majority of these problems. Here's why. In the UK, there was a police audit. Approximately 2/3 of all domestic violence incidents reported to the police involved somebody under the influence of just alcohol, not drugs, but just alcohol. The same study also showed that people were more aggressive, more dangerous to each other when alcohol was involved than any other substance. In the United States, 40% of reported domestic violence has the alcohol factor present. And they also agree that the intensity of violence increases when the offender is intoxicated compared to somebody who's not. Men, I know, men tend to be more aggressive when they're drinking alcohol. Women are more likely to be abused and suffer physical violence when they're intoxicated. So men are more aggressive and women are more likely to get beat when there's alcohol involved and people are intoxicated. Bottom line, no, don't drink alcohol socially. There are two others. I said that was my last one, but there are two others. One was one that was taught to me by my mother. I love my mother. She's a genius, and she's a genius for this reason. And my wife, my current wife right now, and I agree on this. The Holy Ghost, this may not be biblical, the Holy Ghost goes to bed at midnight. Okay. All right, that's not biblical, but keep the point in mind. When you're dating, doing an activity, and then going home alone, how likely is it that you're going to get intoxicated and get into domestic violence? How likely is it for you to become a teen who's pregnant if you're going home by yourself alone, right? Save that for marriage. Get married, move in together, do it the right way. Last thing, love your spouse like you love yourself. Ephesians 5:33 or 25, I'm not sure. But love your spouse and remind them of that every single day. And this is my last point. Remind your community that you love them as well, the people that are close to you. When you see people, tell them that you love them. And I'm grateful for this opportunity. It's been wonderful to meet all of you. I love your bright, smiling energy. Thank you. We doing questions? Okay. All right, let's open the floor to any questions that you have, and nothing is off the table. Everything is fair game. Oh, do you want me to? Okay.
And then you started talking about a cure, what we can do to help ourselves or even help someone else that's in domestic violence. You said the first person that you should go to is your pastor. In other words, for counseling. Okay. What if you go to your pastor? This is a hypothetical question. What if you go to your pastor and this man is beating you obliviously, treating you like an animal, and your pastor tell you to pray and stay there?
It's a great question. What do you do? So the question is, what happens when you go to your pastor and your pastor tells you to pray about it? And that's probably, that is a good portion of it, but you're being beaten, mercilessly. How do you approach that situation? Well, first of all, listen to your pastor. Number one, your pastor does know prayer does work. But number two, prayer doesn't work if you don't do something about it. And so you need to step up, and you do need to do something. If you have experienced domestic violence, you need to do something. You need to do it. You have children, you have neighbors, you have a community who watches this. And if we all stay silent and do nothing, the problem gets worse. So I don't know if you've driven down Gamble anytime recently, but it's wild. And a lot of this stems from original sources of domestic violence, broken homes, and then people going to the streets because they don't have a family to go to. So that's what I would say.
I have a question. So when somebody is involved in domestic violence and say the person get away with it, is there a statute of limitation concerning domestic violence?
Yeah, so when we're talking about statute of limitations, we're generally talking about whether we can sue them in a civil court or whether the state can prosecute them as a criminal. If we never report domestic violence, nobody can do anything about it. For example, if somebody beats me and I have a bunch of medical damages, I can actually sue that person to recover money so that I can pay for my medical damages. But I can also go to the police, have that person arrested, and I don't even have to pay for the case. The state will pay for the case and the prosecution and handle all of that. But if you don't do something about it, the problem never gets solved. A lot of these programs, I should mention too, is when there's like a criminal component to it, the judges will actually order the individuals to participate in what's called a batterer's intervention program. In custody cases, if a person commits 2 acts of domestic violence or more, then they are not allowed to have any custody, not legal custody, not physical custody, until they've overcome that presumption of a history of domestic violence. And one of the ways they can do that is by engaging in a batterer's intervention program. It's 36 weeks, 1 hour a week, once a week. Takes a long time. And I've actually heard from people who have participated in these types of programs that is a good resource. It's called the Men and Women's Center here in Anchorage, Alaska, that does those. You don't actually have to have a court order in order to do them. If you're working through your own relationship and say you have been a victim of domestic violence and you do want somebody else to change, you can have them participate in that voluntarily. And there's a lot of other counseling programs as well that can help people with their anger management. Yep, DVIP, yeah, Domestic Violence Intervention Program. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
Okay, she asked if there was statute of limitations.
Oh, yes, yeah, I should probably answer the question. You're right. Is there a statute of limitation? So with sexual assault, there is no statute of limitation. Okay. With other domestic violence, there can be, what is it, 10-year statute of limitations? At most, a 10-year statute of limitations for a criminal case to go forward. But here's what I'll tell you. If you don't report domestic violence right when it occurs, nobody's going to do anything about it. You know, if you get 5 months down the road and you're like, you know what, I really didn't like those black eyes, and you go to the, you know, if you go to APD, you know, and you walk in there, you're not going to have them by then. You know, they're not going to have any evidence. It's going to be much harder to prosecute it. Also, too, COVID did not help domestic violence, and here's why. First of all, it cooped us all up together, and then we realized who we were. Bunch of animals. No, no, it cooped us all up together. And then what happened is there was a lot of domestic violence that occurred, and criminal cases were not being adjudicated, which means there was a huge backlog of criminal cases. And so now the district attorney's office are just swamped, super swamped with a lot of cases. And so when they have that many cases, if they're comparing your case that's been waiting for 5 months to be brought up and somebody else's case that's, you know, been 2 days after the fact, they're going to prosecute the 2 day after the fact case. Now, here's the thing. You may love your household members, but they may be committing domestic violence. Take action anyway. People are not going to change unless you do. And if that means that it pulls them out of your life so that they can go figure themselves out, it needs to happen because it is so harmful. This is the #1 case that our courts see, just so we're clear, is domestic violence. There is more domestic violence than there are divorces. And, you know, statistically, we have a really high percentage of divorces. Any other questions? Yeah, and the statute of limitations will vary on the type of domestic violence that it is. Just keep that in mind too.
A question. I was made aware of this young girl who's living with a guy, okay, and they have a number of children together. And at one point she was pregnant and he throws her down a flight of stairs. The children are in the house and she's afraid to leave this man because she feels that he's going to kill her. Well, if you stay with him, he might kill you too. So how do you protect the children who are in the home who are witnessing this activity or this violence?
Well, first of all, if he kills you, well, then you're dead and there's nothing anybody can do about that. Second of all, it's not just your life that's on the line in the moment. It's your children who are going to grow up with that. And that's what ruins lives. It's these long-term effects that carry on for years and years that then affect other families. Think about it for a second. Think about the exponential effect of domestic violence. If there's domestic violence in your household and you have 5 children, and those children experience that domestic violence day in and day out, and you stayed with him because you were afraid that if you left, he was going to kill you, you now have 5 children who know that when there's a problem and they can't control the emotions of the other person, they will force them to do what they want by beating them, right? By coercing them, by doing all these other forms of domestic violence. Now those 5 children go out, find partners, have children, and say they have 5 children each. That's 5 times 5. How many children are we talking about? How many households are we talking about? And from that point on, it is like dynamite. It is explosive and all throughout the community. Based on that one decision to not leave because we were afraid we were going to die. Greater love hath no man than he give his life. Okay, right. If you're willing to put down your life for your friend, and in this context, I would say your children, that's one of the greatest demonstrations of love I think a person can actually show. So save lives by doing the right thing, reporting domestic violence, and protecting those around you.
I just want to make a comment. A lot of times we are afraid to get involved because we don't want to hurt anybody. But I think when you don't get involved, that's when you're really hurt. We had a next door neighbor, and almost every night they were fighting. And I was afraid at the time to do anything because it's not my business. I'm just gonna stay away. My granddaughter came to spend the night and it scared her. She said, Nana, what's going on? Why are they screaming? Why is this? Why is that? But it had such an impact on my granddaughter. After she left my home, I felt like I had to do something. And not just for my granddaughter, but for the children that were living in that home and that were experiencing that type of activity. And so don't be afraid to call the police. The more you call, the more help they will get. I work for North Star Behavioral Health. And a lot of the children that I work with are children that are coming from what? Domestic violence. The only way they know how to communicate is through violence. If they can't get what they want, they communicate through violence. And my job is to redirect and role model how it should be done. The unfortunate thing with this, sometimes they go right back to that same environment. So if we don't take a stand as Christians, as people living in the community, and do not call when we hear this, we're creating more damage than we are anything else.
Yep, I completely agree. And if it goes unreported, the problem gets worse. But if everyone knows that it can't occur, who's going to want to do it, right? If they know that if they yell loud enough that the neighbors will hear and report it, well, they're not going to yell so loud, right? If they know that the neighbors are going to see black eyes and broken bones, and they're going to report it, the less likely it will occur. What a blessing, though, that you have that opportunity to work and role model for those children. That's really a cool thing.
Answer to your question, OCS will take care of those children. So if they're in a situation where the parent is afraid to leave, that's why they have OCS. But the biggest problem that I see behind children growing up in homes where it's a lot of abuse, they end up coming to see me when they in their teenage years, not even adults, because they learn how to self-medicate to not feel the pain or not hear their parent fighting, or they end up in the same kind of relationship because they learn that's what's acceptable. So we don't help them before they get to the point that they are adapting these same behaviors. We're just going to be creating a village of dysfunctional people.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that keeps being kind of alluded to, but not really discussed, that I'd like to touch on is people who are victims of domestic violence tend to, first of all, not report it, and they tend to gravitate back to it. They don't like to leave it for some reason. And that's the stranglehold that literally the stranglehold that domestic violence has on relationships and individuals. I even had a girlfriend, we were dating at the time, and she ended up breaking up with me to go back with her boyfriend, who had literally blackened both of her eyes, busted her lip. But she had kids with him, and she felt like it was the important thing to do. I hope he changed. I hope they are in a loving relationship. But I was so shocked at the fact that she would want to do that, that it was then that I realized how catastrophic domestic violence really is. It is a real thing. And people who are victims of it and who don't know anything else go towards whatever is normal for them. Anybody else have any other questions? Sure. And then we'll okay, sounds good. Yeah, so the difference between civil and criminal is there are two types of courts in Alaska. There's a criminal court and there is a civil court. In a civil court, you can actually go report domestic violence, and then the court can issue a 20-day ex parte domestic violence protective order like the one we talked about, as well as the long-term protective order. And that will protect you. That will keep that other individual in check and away, or in healthy parameters to protect you. Criminal domestic violence is when somebody's committed a crime, the police are called, they investigate, the prosecutor then tells them that they have a case, they go arrest that individual for domestic violence, and then they take them to jail because they perpetrated domestic violence. So those are the two differences. And at our office, we deal with primarily the civil cases, right? Protecting people in the civil arena, because most people don't like calling the police, but they still want to be protected. Frankly, you should do both, right? Call the police, report domestic violence, and then go down to your courthouse and get a protective order so that you can get out of the situation. And then, you know, like I said before, call me, call Catholic Services, call OCS, you know, use your resources in the community. Awake is another program, and so on. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad I had this opportunity to meet you all and share this with you.